In May 2025, a hushed atmosphere enveloped the evidence storage room of the Coles County Sheriff's Office in Illinois, where rows of time-worn metal filing cabinets stood silently. Fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over dusty sealed boxes as a cold case investigator gently opened an evidence container that had been forgotten for nearly 40 years. "Confirming case number again," she said into her radio, her voice low and deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the silence in the sealed room. What began as a routine review of old files was now turning into something entirely different, something that could finally answer questions that had haunted Charleston for decades. Inside the box were small items, documents, biological samples, and handwritten notes from 1987. Items once deemed insufficient to continue the investigation. Items tied to the name Laura Jean Whitmore. Laura Whitmore, a 48-year-old elementary school teacher, left Charleston Elementary School on a fall afternoon in 1987 and never made it home. For nearly 40 years, her disappearance remained an open wound the town had learned not to mention. A wife, a mother, a respected teacher, vanished without a clear crime scene. The last person to see Laura only recalled that she left school on time, as she always did. Local media at the time called it Illinois' traceless disappearance. The initial search lasted days but yielded only dead ends, exhaustion, and vague theories. As the investigation cooled, the file was closed with a brief note, "Missing, whereabouts unknown." Life moved on, Charleston changed, memories faded. Laura's family grew older with unanswered questions, but nearly 4 decades later, a decision to reopen those old evidence boxes changed everything. Inside were details once undervalued, traces once voiceless. As modern DNA science was applied, old assumptions began to crumble. This discovery was more than an effort to resolve a missing person case. It was the first domino in a chain of truths hidden by time, bias, and the belief that small towns are always safe. Because as investigators began following the new leads, they realized the suspect was not a stranger. It was someone who had existed within the community, seen, trusted, and never suspected. The Laura Jean Whitmore case is not just a mystery revived. It is proof of the persistence of generations of investigators, the power of technology to give voice to the lost, and evidence that justice, even buried for decades, can still find its way back. It is also the story of a community forced to confront its own past, where silence once sheltered secrets, and where truth is finally beginning to shine through. Tonight we return to the fall of 1987, tracing every clue in Charleston's most haunting disappearance, and witnessing how time, science, and persistence collide to break a silence that lasted nearly 40 years. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In the fall of 1987, the town of Charleston, Illinois, was immersed in the familiar quiet rhythm of Midwestern life, where tree-lined streets, low-rise neighborhoods, and the sound of school bells ringing each afternoon created a sense of near-absolute safety. And in that seemingly ordinary setting, Laura Jean Whitmore was last seen in a way that was completely routine, just like any other day in her life. That afternoon, Laura left Charleston Elementary School after finishing her teaching duties, carrying the familiar habits of an elementary teacher who had been dedicated to the school, her colleagues, and a daily routine that was so stable it almost never changed. No one noted any haste, stress, or signs of unease in her, and there were no words or actions suggesting she was preparing for a sudden change in her personal plans. To her family, Laura coming home on time was almost a given, because she strictly adhered to her daily schedule, especially after work, and failing to notify them of any change was something that had never happened in their years together. When the usual time for Laura to return home passed without any sign of her, the family's initial feeling was only mild concern, explained away by familiar possibilities, like stopping to visit someone, handling a personal errand, or a minor delay for some small reason along the way, because Charleston was a small town where delays were easily explained and rarely carried serious meaning. However, as time continued to stretch on without any call or message from Laura, worry began to creep into the home, because this silence did not fit her habits of communication and personal responsibility. By the time evening closed in, and Laura still had not returned, the family began to realize that this absence had crossed the line of an ordinary delay, because she had no history of staying out overnight, no pattern of cutting off contact, and no clear reason to alter her routine without notice. In an effort to reassure themselves, family members began searching spontaneously, calling relatives, friends, co-workers at the school, and familiar places Laura might have stopped after work, hoping she was simply somewhere unexpected. Each call was made with growing tension, and each negative response gradually eliminated the most optimistic assumptions. When familiar leads yielded nothing, the family expanded their search as much as they could, checking the routes Laura usually took, visiting places she frequented, but everything left no clear trace of her presence after that afternoon. What made the worry increasingly heavy was not just Laura failing to return home on schedule, but the complete absence of any information that could confirm where she was, who she was with, or what her intentions were. No note, no signs of preparation, and no one confirming they had seen her after leaving school. Throughout their own search efforts, the family gradually had to face the reality that this disappearance could not be explained by familiar scenarios, as every reasonable possibility was ruled out by the lack of confirming information. The later it got, the more frightening Laura's prolonged silence became, because it completely shattered the image of a responsible woman, deeply attached to her family, who always maintained a clear presence in daily life. When no more leads remained for an effective search, the family faced a difficult but unavoidable decision: to report it to the police, not because there was already evidence that something terrible had definitely happened, but because Laura's prolonged absence had exceeded every normal threshold, and could no longer be handled through personal efforts alone. The decision to report was made in a heavy atmosphere, because it meant acknowledging that Laura Jean Whitmore was not simply late or temporarily out of touch, but had truly vanished from the family's everyday life. And from that moment, the familiar calm of Charleston was shattered by an unanswered question, marking the point when Laura was officially recorded as missing. The report of Laura Jean Whitmore's disappearance was received by local law enforcement shortly after the family realized her prolonged absence could no longer be explained by ordinary daily reasons. From that point, the case was officially entered into the system and processed according to procedures for adult missing persons cases, in which initial information was recorded in a structured way, including the victim's full identity, age, occupation, residence address, immediate family relationships, the last time she was seen, along with the family's own search efforts before contacting police. The intake process did not occur amid panic or chaos, but followed standard procedure, as the duty officer asked questions to determine whether this was a voluntary departure, an unusual delay, or a potentially risky situation. The responses showed no clear signs that Laura had prepared to leave home for an extended period, nor any confirmation that she had informed anyone of a change in her routine. Based on that initial data, the case was classified as a missing person with unknown cause, a status requiring early investigative steps, rather than waiting, as was customary for presumed voluntary departures. This decision marked an important shift from the family's own search phase to official intervention by authorities. A case file was created with its own number, and all related information was standardized for future retrieval and updates. With the last confirmed sighting of Laura treated as the primary reference point, while the time elapsed since then until the report was noted to assess urgency and potential risk. Immediately after the file was opened, personnel were assigned to ensure clear responsibility. A lead investigator was designated to compile information, set initial investigative direction, and coordinate related units, while support officers were tasked with gathering supplementary data, checking available sources, and preparing for field verification if needed. Concurrently, the initial scope of investigation was defined based on what was known at intake, focusing on Laura's familiar living spaces, usual routes, places she might have gone that day, and personal relationships, likely to provide reliable information, while maintaining necessary caution to avoid narrowing the scope too early, without sufficient facts. In this launch phase, investigators made no conclusions about the cause or circumstances of the disappearance, prioritizing instead the establishment of a framework for systematic information collection and comparison, including identifying what had been checked and what remained open, to avoid duplication or oversight of important data. File creation also required regular updates, since any new information, however small, could affect situation assessment. The family was instructed to contact immediately if any relevant details emerged, while investigators prepared for the next step approaching Laura's residence and related areas. At this stage, the case was still viewed as a disappearance with multiple possibilities, from unintended delay to more serious scenarios, and that uncertainty required balancing urgency with caution, ensuring all actions were based on facts rather than speculation. The entire intake and launch process occurred within a short time frame, sufficient to move the case from report status to official active handling, while retaining the flexibility needed to adjust approach as new information arose. From here, Laura Jean Whitmore's disappearance was no longer just an unexplained gap in family life, but an active investigative file aimed at clarifying what had happened in the time since she vanished up to the present moment. Immediately after Laura Jean Whitmore's missing person file was created and the official investigation launched, the next procedural step was implemented directly and without delay: a search of the victim's residence. The home was considered the final space most likely to retain objective signs of circumstances before Laura disappeared, and early access aimed to minimize the risk of loss or contamination of initial evidence. The investigative team conducted a full survey of the residence following standard sequence, starting with main and secondary entrances, then expanding to functional rooms, common areas and private spaces, with the goal of recording overall scene condition before delving into specific details. What first drew attention during the process was the outward integrity of the home. No signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no improperly opened windows, no evidence of a struggle or clear physical disturbance. The general state of the rooms indicated daily life had not been abruptly interrupted. Items were in their usual places, no signs of ransacking or haste. This required investigators to be cautious in evaluating the hypothesis that Laura might have been forced to leave from the residence itself, because if such an event occurred, physical traces would typically be likely. After completing the overall status recording, the team moved to detailed documentation of Laura's personal items, focusing on everyday objects typically taken when leaving home. Her personal handbag was confirmed still in the house, in its usual spot, with no signs of movement, an important data point, because per her routine, Laura rarely left without it. Additionally, her eyeglasses were found at the residence, in normal condition and undamaged. Their presence further reinforced the assessment that any departure, if it occurred, was not part of an active or extended plan, as leaving glasses behind would cause significant daily inconvenience for Laura. Her personal vehicle was checked and confirmed parked in its usual area, with no signs of recent long-distance use, and the vehicle's condition showed no mechanical issues or tampering, thus ruling out the possibility that Laura had driven away from the area immediately before the disappearance. Beyond larger items, investigators also scanned smaller details like clothing, shoes and bedroom personal effects, finding no unusual shortages, no packed luggage, no items gathered in a way suggesting a planned trip. This consistency across living spaces made the voluntary long-term departure hypothesis harder to support. Concurrently with item documentation, the team assessed the possibility that Laura left voluntarily, but briefly, for example, stepping out short-term with intent to return soon. In that scenario, leaving the handbag, glasses and car could be partially explained. However, this hypothesis still raised major questions given that the absence had extended far beyond what would be acceptable for a short activity, with no communication arising during that time. Investigators also noted no signs that Laura had arranged work or personal responsibilities for a prolonged absence, no canceled appointments, no advance notice to family or colleagues, further weakening the likelihood that her disappearance resulted from a deliberate, considered decision. Throughout the search, every detail was documented, photographed, and stored per protocol to ensure initial data could be cross-referenced later if new information emerged, while avoiding emotional interpretation in the early stage when data was limited. The aggregated results from the residence search painted a consistent picture. The home showed no clear violent event, yet provided no evidence supporting Laura leaving voluntarily in a normal state. This contradiction made the scene evidentially neutral, a point where no definitive conclusion could be drawn, but which served as a foundational basis for subsequent assessments. From a procedural standpoint, the lack of disturbance did not mean completely ruling out external intervention, as scenarios leaving no obvious traces can still occur, especially if departure happened without resistance or disguised as normal activity. Thus, investigators maintained multiple parallel hypotheses, avoiding early lock-in of direction. Upon concluding the search, the overall assessment was that the residence provided no direct evidence explaining Laura Jean Whitmore's disappearance, but did supply an important set of facts showing she had not prepared for extended absence, had not taken essential personal items for daily life, and had left no signs indicating her absence was part of a pre-planned arrangement. These findings became the basis for continuing the investigation with focus on clarifying what occurred outside her residence in the time, from her last sighting until the case was reported. Following the neutral conclusions obtained from the search of Laura Jean Whitmore's residence, the investigative focus immediately shifted to reconstructing the timeline of the day she disappeared, because in a context where the scene provided no direct answers, the timeline became the primary tool for determining the logic of her movements, the last points of contact, and the gaps that might conceal what had happened. This work began with collecting statements from all individuals who might have had contact with Laura on that day, or in the period immediately preceding her disappearance, including family members, colleagues at the school, neighbors, and anyone with regular daily interaction with her, with the goal not of seeking a decisive account, but of building a chain of small discrete facts that could be pieced together into an overall picture. The investigators recorded the statements in chronological order, prioritizing the identification of the last moment Laura was seen or contacted, while cross-referencing the accounts to eliminate distortions due to subjective memory or speculation, and through this they established an initial time frame for the day of the disappearance, in which Laura's morning and early afternoon were described as proceeding exactly according to her usual routine, with no signs that she was under pressure, involved in conflict, or facing an unusual event that would force her to change her schedule. Statements from her work environment showed that Laura completed her daily responsibilities in a normal manner, did not cancel plans, did not leave work unusually unfinished, and made no statements or actions suggesting she was about to leave the area or cut off contact. From these facts, the investigators determined that Laura's disappearance did not stem from a spontaneous decision related to work or a public event that could easily be traced, and therefore the critical time period needed to be gradually narrowed to the hours after she left her familiar daily environments that day. The process of building the schedule continued by identifying potential movement intervals based on daily habits, commonly used routes, and recurring activities, thereby creating a hypothetical time map in which each hour was linked to a likely location or activity state, even if unconfirmed. In this process, the investigators paid special attention to periods without direct witnesses or confirming data, because those very gaps could hold key information about Laura's disappearance, and accurately determining the length and location of those gaps became a priority operational objective. Through cross-referencing statements and supporting facts, a significant time gap was identified in the latter half of the day, when Laura was not seen or contacted by anyone, and there was also no indication that she had returned home, and this gap was marked as the point most needing clarification in the entire timeline. Parallel to identifying the gap, the investigators also assessed the reliability of each statement, considering the possibility of mistakes regarding time, place, or sequence of events, and therefore the established time points were not fixed numbers, but estimated ranges with clearly noted margins of error in the file. Once the basic schedule had been established, the next step was to formulate initial hypotheses to explain Laura's disappearance within the context of the existing timeline, and these hypotheses were built based on what the timeline permitted or ruled out, rather than on emotional speculation. The hypothesis of voluntary departure was considered first, as it is a possibility often raised in adult missing persons cases. However, when compared to the timeline, this hypothesis encountered many inconsistencies, particularly the fact that Laura left no signs of preparation beforehand, and made no contact during the entire period of absence, which was difficult to reconcile with the habits confirmed through statements. The hypothesis of an unexpected incident, such as an accident occurring out of sight, was also proposed, but the timeline provided no direct data supporting this possibility within the familiar area, and the absence of reports or discoveries kept this hypothesis at a purely theoretical level. At the same time, the hypothesis of external intervention, though lacking clear physical evidence, remained open because the timeline showed Laura had a period without supervision or confirmation, sufficient for any serious event to occur without leaving immediate traces in her living space. The purpose of formulating these hypotheses was not to immediately select a single investigative direction, but to identify specific questions that needed answers in subsequent steps, such as where Laura went during the gap period, whether she met anyone, and if so, where and under what circumstances. Throughout the timeline construction process, the investigators continuously updated the file with new time points or adjusted old ones when additional information was discovered, ensuring that the timeline was not a rigid structure, but a dynamic tool that could change as facts changed. The final result of this phase was not a complete answer, but a time map clearly showing what had been confirmed, what remained unclear, and the points requiring concentrated resources for clarification, in which the identified time gap became the focal point of all subsequent efforts. From an operational perspective, constructing the timeline at this stage achieved the core objective of shifting the case from a descriptive state to an analytical one, where Laura Jean Whitmore's disappearance was no longer viewed merely as an isolated event, but placed within a specific time sequence with clear missing points, creating a logical foundation for deploying further investigative activities based on the central unanswered question: what happened to Laura during the period when no one knew where she was? From the foundation of the established timeline with its confirmed points and unexplained gaps, the investigation moved to the phase of field deployment, aimed at testing hypotheses that could be ruled out or strengthened through specific actions, in which the first step was determining the search area based on the logical possible movements of Laura Jean Whitmore on the day she disappeared, combining daily habits, commonly used routes, locations she might have briefly visited, and a reasonable radius of movement within the identified gap period. The determination of the area was not based on intuition, but on operational analysis, prioritizing spaces directly linked to Laura's schedule, while also accounting for the possibility that she might have deviated from familiar routes for an unexpected reason. Therefore, the search scope was designed in concentric circles, starting from the area near her residence and daily activity points, and gradually expanding to peripheral zones, with the goal of balancing comprehensiveness with efficient use of resources. Once the search scope was approved, on-the-ground search activities were deployed in multiple layers, including direct sweeping by personnel at the scene, checking natural and man-made areas that could obscure visibility, and verifying information at transportation points. But throughout this process, investigators always maintained focus on collecting objective facts, rather than expecting to find clear evidence immediately. Because experience showed that many missing persons cases leave no obvious evidence in the early stages, the searched areas were recorded in detail in the file, including time, participating personnel, sweeping methods and results, to ensure that all efforts could be cross-referenced later, and to avoid repeating or missing already checked spaces. parallel to the territorial search. Another operational axis was deployed, narrowing down relationships potentially related to Laura's disappearance, based on the assumption that if she did not leave in a completely random manner, then the event leading to her disappearance might be tied to a specific, even brief, interaction with another person on or before that day. The list of relationships was compiled based on multiple levels of contact, from family, colleagues, neighbors, to individuals with infrequent, but still possible daily encounters with Laura, and each relationship was evaluated based on recent contact frequency, the nature of the relationship, and the ability to provide verifiable information. The narrowing process was not aimed at immediately identifying a suspect, but at categorizing information sources, thereby prioritizing interviews, verifications, and cross-referencing of statements, according to relevance, while avoiding spreading resources into directions without investigative value. In this process, the investigators cross-referenced information obtained from relationships with the established timeline to determine whether any connection overlapped with the gap period or could explain Laura's absence in a specific time frame, and when no overlap was found, those relationships were gradually placed in the low direct relevance category. The elimination of unsupported directions was carried out systematically and in parallel, because every direction not eliminated consumed time and resources, and therefore early identification of hypotheses inconsistent with actual facts was necessary to keep the investigative process from becoming scattered. The excluded hypotheses included possibilities not supported by the timeline, lacking witness confirmation, or contradicting records from the scene, and Laura's personal belongings, and each exclusion decision was clearly noted in the file, to ensure transparency, and the ability to review if needed. Throughout the search and narrowing phase, investigators continuously updated assessments of scope and approach, adjusting search plans when an area had been fully swept, or when a direction showed no new information, and this flexibility reflected the effort to maintain an investigative pace appropriate to the still undefined nature of the case. Although the search activities were deployed on a wide scale and relationships were screened in multiple layers, the results obtained in this phase yielded no specific trace leading directly to Laura, and this forced the investigative team to confront the reality that her disappearance left no easily traceable signs within the familiar area or among the verified close relationships. From an operational perspective, the lack of positive results from search and narrowing did not equate to failure, because it allowed investigators to eliminate a series of possibilities and gradually narrow what might have happened, while creating a detailed file of directions that had been checked and excluded, reducing the risk of repeating mistakes or overlooking information in subsequent steps. By the end of this phase, the investigative picture showed that Laura left no clear trace in the initial search areas, no relationship emerged as a direct connection to her disappearance, and the most accessible investigative directions had been successively ruled out, causing the case to enter a more complex state, where every remaining possibility required new facts or previously unrecorded events to continue progressing. When the search and narrowing activities yielded no specific results, the investigative process entered a more passive waiting state, in which any new information was considered as potential signals capable of breaking the formed deadlock, and it was in that context that the investigating agency began receiving anonymous tips related to the disappearance of Laura Jean Whitmore, information not accompanied by the provider's identity, without legal responsibility commitment, but still required to be recorded and evaluated according to procedure due to the small possibility that they might lead to previously undiscovered clues. The initial anonymous tips were fragmented, inconsistent in content, some merely repeating hypotheses already considered, while others provided details that could not be immediately verified, and this required investigators to apply strict screening methods to distinguish between potentially valuable information and noise, avoiding redispersing resources into already excluded directions. In the process of receiving and handling these tips, a distinctly different event occurred when a package was sent to a law enforcement agency outside the jurisdiction directly handling the missing persons case, and upon being opened according to proper safety procedures, the package was determined to contain a portion of human remains, along with a typed unsigned letter, creating a serious turning point in the entire case. The receipt of this package was immediately reported and transferred to the team investigating the Laura Whitmore file. Because the letter's content showed a direct connection to the disappearance under investigation, and from that moment, the case was no longer viewed solely as a no-trace missing persons matter, but began to take on characteristics potentially involving the victim's death. The letter accompanying the remains provided no information about the sender's identity or motive, but contained specific directions to another location purportedly, where additional remains could be found, and the level of detail in these directions was sufficient for the investigating agency to take them seriously and deploy field verification, while still maintaining necessary caution regarding the possibility of misdirection. After completing legal procedures and ensuring safety, the investigative team coordinated with relevant units to recover remains according to the letter's directions, approaching the specified area, and conducting controlled searches, recording position, environmental conditions, and any factors that might affect later evaluation. The result of this process was the recovery of additional remains portions, handled according to standard procedures to preserve forensic value, and all recovered samples were transferred to the forensic agency for examination, while investigators simultaneously reviewed previously received anonymous tips to determine if any matched or supplemented the new facts. The forensic examination phase focused first on confirming identity, because in the context of a prolonged missing persons case with no prior direct traces, determining whether the recovered remains belonged to Laura Jean Whitmore was the central question deciding the next direction of the entire investigation, and forensic experts used methods appropriate to the conditions of that time for comparison. The examination results showed that the recovered remains matched Laura's biological characteristics, and through available identification methods, the victim's identity was confirmed, thereby ending any possibility that Laura had simply disappeared without serious harm. While marking an important legal milestone for the case, however, the examination process also revealed clear limitations when the condition of the remains and environmental factors did not allow precise determination of cause of death, did not clarify the mechanism of death, did not detect specific signs linkable to a particular method of homicide, and this caused the forensic conclusion to stop at identity confirmation without providing further answers about the manner or circumstances leading to Laura's death. The absence of a cause of death conclusion created a paradox in the investigative process, where on one hand the case now had authentic evidence of the victim's death, but on the other hand lacked sufficiently strong forensic data to point to specific criminal conduct or directly linked to an individual or event, making the investigative picture both clearer regarding the outcome and more obscure regarding the sequence of events. From an operational perspective, the receipt of anonymous information, the package containing remains, and the forensic examination results fundamentally changed the nature of the case, but also posed new challenges when the most important facts lacked clear origin or traceable evidence, and therefore the investigative team had to record the entire chain of events in detail in the file, including receipt method, handling and conclusions, to ensure that every decision had clear basis and could be re-examined if new information emerged. In that context, the case entered a more complex state, where confirming the victim's identity did not equate to clarifying the cause of death, and recovering the remains did not directly lead to identifying the perpetrator, causing the investigators to confront the reality that despite a decisive step forward, the central question of the case remained unanswered, and all facts obtained in this phase, from anonymous tips to forensic results, became important but insufficient pieces to complete the full picture of what happened to Laura Jean Whitmore. After the identity of the remains was confirmed as belonging to Laura Jean Whitmore, but the cause of death could not be determined, the investigation entered a particularly difficult phase, when all the collected data, although legally decisive regarding the victim's status, failed to produce any specific trail leading to a perpetrator, and it was precisely this gap that made identifying a suspect impossible in the context of the investigative and forensic tools of that time, which had many limitations. The investigators proceeded to review the entire list of individuals who had been circled in previous phases, cross-referencing every relationship, every statement, every hypothesis that had been proposed, and every investigative direction that had been pursued, but no name emerged with sufficient conditions to be elevated to the status of official suspect, because no one had a clearly proven motive. No one was found to have a direct connection to the locations where the remains were recovered, and no one left physical traces that could be linked to the case according to criminal evidence standards. In that context, the failure to identify a suspect was not the result of an obvious oversight, but the consequence of every approach leading to the same dead ends, where the available data was not strong enough to cross the threshold from speculation to legal basis, and this forced the investigative team to confront the reality that the case could not progress further without new information or scientific advancements superior to what was currently available. Parallel to the inability to identify a suspect, the lack of sufficient evidence to charge became the biggest barrier to continuing the investigation, because although there was proof of Laura's death, the file still lacked the core elements needed to build a criminal indictment, including the mechanism of the crime, the exact time of death, the location where the act leading to death occurred, and a direct connection between a specific individual and those acts. And when these elements could not be proven, any effort to pursue criminal liability could not advance beyond the internal review stage. The limited forensic conclusions prevented investigators from determining whether Laura's death was the result of an intentional act, an accident, or a complex sequence of events that left no clear traces, and this ambiguity made prioritizing resources for continued investigation difficult in a context where law enforcement agencies had to simultaneously handle many other cases that were more urgent and had higher solvability potential. When traditional investigative directions had been thoroughly exhausted, from searching areas, circling relationships, analyzing anonymous tips, to forensic examinations, without yielding new progress, the investigative team was forced to reassess the feasibility of continuing the case under the current model, and the conclusion reached was that the investigation no longer had a viable path in the short term. This decision was not made abruptly, but was the result of multiple internal meetings in which the investigators presented the entire process that had been carried out, pointed out the points that had been checked, and those still left open, while considering the possibility that the missing data might only appear when technological conditions or the context changed in the future. During this process, the case file was reviewed to ensure that all documents, physical evidence, and conclusions were fully, clearly, and accessibly stored, because freezing the investigation did not mean completely abandoning the case, but rather shifting it to a different status within the system, where it was preserved so that it could be reopened if new elements emerged. When the decision to change status was made, the case was officially classified as a cold case, a term reflecting that active investigative progress had stopped, but the file still existed in the system with the potential for reactivation, and this transition carried significant administrative importance as it redefined resource allocation,
priority level and monitoring responsibility. From that point onward, active investigative activities such as field searches, extensive interviews, or in-depth analyses were no longer routinely conducted, but only performed if new information arose, while the file was moved to controlled storage status, with physical evidence sealed and preserved according to regulations to ensure long-term value. Freezing the file also involved formally recording that, at that time, the investigative agency did not have sufficient grounds to continue pursuing the case in a criminal direction, and this was reflected in internal reports as a temporary conclusion, not as an assertion that the matter had been resolved, but as an acknowledgement that current limitations did not allow further progress. In actual practice, the cold case status often carries a paradox in that it both marks the end of one investigative phase and opens the possibility for another in the future, and for the Laura Jean Whitmore case, this meant that all the central questions remained unanswered, but were placed in a state of waiting for new conditions that could change the situation. The outcome of the entire process leading to freezing the file was a dense investigative document set recording every step taken, every hypothesis considered, and every reason they were ruled out, forming a foundation that any future investigator could access to fully understand the context and logic of the decisions made. And it was precisely this completeness that was the key factor in keeping the case, though temporarily unsolvable, in a state ready for reactivation when conditions allowed. From the moment the file was shifted to cold case status, the disappearance and death of Laura Jean Whitmore was no longer an active ongoing case in the proactive sense, but became a dormant file in the system, carrying with it all the unanswered questions, and awaiting a different time when the limitations that once forced the investigation to stop could be overcome.
The frozen status of the Laura Jean Whitmore case file lasted for many years until operational conditions changed sufficiently to bring the matter back onto the review list, and the decision to reopen the file did not stem from a single event or external pressure, but was the result of a systematic evaluation of unsolved backlog cases in storage, in which files that simultaneously met multiple factors, such as confirmed victim identity, preserved physical evidence, and clear investigative gaps, were prioritized for consideration. In that context, the Whitmore case was brought up for discussion as a typical example, because although there was evidence of the victim's death, the entire chain of events leading to that outcome remained unclear, and the limitations that had once forced the investigation to stop primarily stemmed from technological and methodological constraints. Factors that had changed significantly over time. The choice to reopen the file was not viewed as a firm commitment that the case could be solved, but as a reasoned experimental decision, based on the assumption that modern investigative tools could re-explore old data in ways that were previously impossible. When the decision was approved, the file was moved from storage status to active processing status, and the assignment of a cold case investigator was carried out to ensure clear responsibility and continuity in the re-investigation process, with a lead investigator tasked with receiving all documents, physical evidence, and related reports, while also being responsible for rebuilding the case picture from scratch. This assignment was not merely administrative, but also marked a shift in approach, as the cold case investigator was expected to approach the file with a fresh perspective, unbound by the assumptions or temporary conclusions formed during the initial investigation phase, yet still required to respect and understand the operational logic that had led to those prior decisions. Immediately after receiving the file, the first step implemented was a comprehensive evaluation of all old documents, including scene reports, interview transcripts, forensic conclusions, internal notes, and the evidence list, with the goal not of immediately seeking a specific clue, but of fully understanding the context in which the case had been investigated and ultimately frozen. This evaluation process was conducted systematically, starting with reviewing the chronological sequence of investigative activities in 1987, identifying the points where the investigation had progressed, the moments when it stalled, and the key decisions that led to the inability to continue pursuing specific directions. While rereading the file, the cold case investigator focused on distinguishing between objectively confirmed facts and speculative hypotheses raised in the context of limited information, because failing to clearly separate these two elements could lead to repeating old mistakes or missing new opportunities. An important part of the overall evaluation was examining the preservation status of physical evidence, including the recovered bone samples, the anonymous letter, and related documents, to determine whether they were still suitable for additional analyses, and if so, what level of intervention was feasible without compromising evidence integrity. Parallel to reviewing physical evidence, old forensic reports were re-examined in light of current standards and technical capabilities, with the aim of determining whether the previously noted limitations were absolute barriers or merely consequences of the technology of that time, and whether any questions that were once unanswerable had now become feasible. During the evaluation, the investigator also paid attention to how anonymous information had been handled, noting whether any details had not been fully explored or were dismissed early, due to lack of verification means at the time, because such information, though previously lacking legal value, could become useful when cross-referenced with new data. The overall evaluation of the old file was not intended to point out individual errors or assign blame for past decisions, but to understand the objective and subjective limitations that shaped the initial investigative process, thereby identifying points where modern approaches could make a difference. When this review was completed at a general level, a preliminary conclusion was formed that the Whitmore file met the necessary criteria to proceed with reinvestigation to a certain extent, because it combined confirmed data, existing physical evidence, and clear logical gaps in the event chain, all factors that could be re-explored using new methods. Reopening the file was therefore not seen as returning to square one, but as a selective continuation of a process that had once been interrupted, in which the initial goal was not to quickly identify a suspect, but to restructure the case within an analytical framework suited to current conditions, posing questions that could not be asked before and re-evaluating answers once considered unattainable. From this point, the Laura Jean Whitmore case officially shifted from dormant file status to active processing status once again, with clear assignment, defined objectives, and an approach built on the foundation of what was known and what was still missing, marking the beginning of a new investigative phase designed to test whether the barriers that once forced the case to be frozen still existed, or had been overcome by changes in time and technology. Directly following the overall file evaluation process, after the Laura Jean Whitmore case was officially reopened, the cold case investigative team moved to a decisive operational step, a full review of the entire investigative process that took place in 1987, not with the goal of immediately seeking a specific suspect, but to understand how the case had been approached, what decisions had been made in the context of that time, and what factors had shaped the investigative trajectory leading to the file being frozen. This review was conducted systematically, beginning with rereading each report in chronological order, reconstructing the flow of decisions by the original investigative agency, and placing each decision within the operational, legal and technological context of 1987, to avoid biased evaluation based on modern standards, while ignoring the objective limitations of the past. In analyzing the initial investigative decision, the cold case investigator noted that many choices were consistent with the standards for handling adult missing persons cases at that time, particularly the cautious tendency to consider the possibility of a voluntary departure when there were no clear signs of violence at the residence, and this foundational assumption influenced resource allocation, the case's priority level in the early days, and the speed of deploying specialized operational measures. The focus on the possibility of voluntary disappearance, though not procedurally wrong at the time, meant that some higher urgency actions, such as expanding searches beyond familiar areas, or more deeply checking less obvious relationships, were not carried out as early as they might have been if the case had been classified from the outset as high risk. Upon deeper analysis, the current investigative team also noted that the original timeline, though meticulously constructed, still had large margins of error due to near-total reliance on witness statements and memories without independent data for verification, leading to important blank periods not being narrowed in time, causing subsequent investigative directions to be more speculative than based on hard facts. From an operational perspective, this was not individual error, but a consequence of when timeline support tools were limited. However, within the overall case, it contributed to reducing the ability to pinpoint the exact critical moment when a serious incident might have occurred. Parallel to analyzing decisions, the cold case team identified systemic operational shortcomings, focusing on points where the investigative process may not have achieved optimal efficiency, despite complying with regulations. One prominent issue noted was the lack of an independent review mechanism for dominant hypotheses, leading to the risk of tunnel vision, where initial assumptions, once formed, tended to dominate subsequent data interpretation, causing information inconsistent with those assumptions to be undervalued or not pursued fully. Additionally, standardization and cross-verification of statements in the early phase were not carried out thoroughly, leaving some minor inconsistencies or details not fully clarified at the time and treated as insignificant discrepancies, even though they could later become important clues when viewed from a different angle. The team also determined that handling anonymous information in 1987, though cautious and procedurally correct, was heavily influenced by the lack of tools to assess reliability and traceability, resulting in such information being considered mainly supplementary rather than an independent investigative axis. And when the package containing remains appeared, the connection between prior anonymous tips and this event was not deeply analyzed due to lacking means and suitable analytical models. Furthermore, management and evaluation of physical evidence in the early phase revealed limitations, not in preservation, but in assessing long-term investigative potential, as some samples were recorded and stored, but not considered high value for analysis
given the technology of the time,
leading to them not being centralized in subsequent investigative directions. From identifying shortcomings, the cold case team moved to the critical task of pinpointing overlooked or underexplored clues, focusing on details already in the file, but never deeply analyzed or deemed secondary. This process did not involve searching for a single forgotten detail, but a systematic review to find intersections between data, timeline, and hypotheses that had not previously been connected. Among the overlooked clues, some related to minor differences in statements about time and location, once explained as memory errors, but when placed against large blank periods in the timeline, suggesting the possibility of reflecting an unrecorded event. Other clues involved Laura Jean Whitmore's social relationships, individuals verified at a basic level, but not deeply analyzed for context, meeting frequency, and potential overlap with unclear time periods, and the lack of deep analysis was seen as a consequence of prioritizing closer, more accessible relationships in the early phase. The team also noted how related locations were evaluated, observing that some areas were searched only briefly, or with limited methods suitable to the initial assumption, but potentially insufficiently comprehensive if the event occurred outside that framework. Identifying overlooked clues was not intended to assert that they would definitely lead to a solution, but to build a list of elements needing re-examination with modern tools and methods, with each clue tied to a specific question and clear verifiability. Throughout the review, the cold case investigator maintained the principle of separating facts from interpretation, avoiding imposing new conclusions on old events without supporting evidence, while carefully noting why a clue had once been overlooked to ensure that re-exploring it in the present was based on grounded analysis rather than emotional assumption. The result of the 1987 investigation review phase was a more comprehensive picture of how the case had been handled, the objective and subjective limitations that influenced the investigative process, and most importantly,
a clear roadmap of points where modern investigation could make a difference, thereby shifting the case from rereading the past to readiness for new investigative actions, designed based on tightly and soundly reformulated questions. From the conclusions drawn during the process of reviewing the 1987 investigation, the cold case investigation team moved to a similarly technical and no less decisive operational step, which was to audit all the remaining physical evidence in the Laura Jean Whitmore case file, because every effort to reinvestigate depended directly on accurately determining what could still be exploited from the physical evidence previously collected. This process began with reviewing the remains that had been recovered and stored since 1987, including cross-checking the original forensic reports, the sealing status, storage conditions, and supporting reports, in order to determine how these samples had been handled, whether they had been interfered with or degraded over time, and whether they still met the necessary standards for additional analysis using modern methods. The investigators worked closely with forensic experts to assess the integrity of the remains, noting the parts that were still intact, the parts affected by environmental factors, and the limitations previously recorded in the old forensic conclusions, while comparing the recovery and storage methods with current standards to identify potential risks that could affect evidentiary value. Concurrently, the file related to the anonymous letter was reviewed in detail, including the manner of receipt, initial handling, security measures applied, and analyses previously performed, because this was one of the few pieces of evidence capable of providing information about the origin or behavior of the individual directly involved in disposing of the remains. Review of the anonymous letter focused not only on the written content, but also on physical elements such as the type of paper, ink, typing method, surface handling traces, and any details that could be reanalyzed with modern technology, while old reports were cross-checked to determine what had been examined and what had never been exploited due to technical limitations at the time. Another key axis of the evidence audit was examining the chain of custody, because the legal value of every piece of evidence depended directly on the ability to prove that it had been collected, stored, and handled continuously, without interruption or unauthorized interference, and therefore the entire movement history of each item of evidence was traced back from the moment of recovery to the present. This process included cross-checking handover records, seals, storage facility conditions, and lawful seal openings, to determine whether there were any gaps in the chain of custody, and if so, the extent to which they affected the usability of the evidence in subsequent investigation and prosecution. In cases where minor gaps or deficiencies were discovered, they were documented and specifically evaluated rather than immediately discarded, because in many cold cases, chain of custody issues do not necessarily render evidence completely worthless, but require a cautious approach and appropriate legal strategy. After completing the review of each group of evidence, the investigation team moved to the step of assessing reanalysis potential, a strategic phase aimed at determining which modern methods could be applied to extract additional information from existing samples, especially in the context of the 1987 forensic limitations that had left many questions unanswered. This assessment was conducted through coordination between investigators and scientific experts, weighing the potential for obtaining new data against the risk of degrading or consuming the evidence, because in cold cases, each sample holds irreplaceable value. For the remains, reanalysis potential was considered at multiple levels, from applying more advanced biological identification techniques to the possibility of extracting genetic material from parts previously deemed insufficient, while for the anonymous letter, material analysis methods, handling traces, and technical characteristics were weighed to determine whether additional information could be drawn about the letter's origin or creation context. Throughout the audit process, the investigation team maintained the principle of not presupposing results, avoiding treating evidence as a key, simply due to expectations, and instead focusing on determining the actual value and limitations of each piece of evidence in order to build a reinvestigation strategy based on what could be provable in court. The results of the evidence audit showed that, despite the passage of many decades, some key pieces of evidence remained in sufficiently good condition to consider reanalysis, while others, though no longer capable of providing new data, still played a foundational role in understanding the case context and logic. From an operational perspective, completing this audit step marked an important milestone as it clearly defined the limits and potential of the entire reinvestigation process, shifting the case from a file analysis state to a state of preparing specific scientific action, in which every subsequent decision had to be based on what the evidence could actually provide, rather than what investigators hoped to find. By clarifying the condition of the remains, the value of the anonymous letter, the integrity of the chain of custody, and reanalysis potential, the cold case team established a solid technical foundation, ensuring that any future progress would be built on verifiable evidence, minimizing the risk of repeating the dead ends that had previously caused the Laura Jean Whitmore case to be frozen.
From the technical foundation established through the evidence audit process, the focus of the reinvestigation shifted to the field of forensic science and modern genetic analysis, because this was the area where the difference between the conditions of 1987 and 2025 was considered most pronounced, while also being the place with the greatest potential to break through the limitations that had previously caused the Laura Jean Whitmore case to be frozen. The first step in this phase was the forensic re-examination of the recovered remains, not to repeat old conclusions, but to reassess the entire sample under the light of current standards and methods, in which forensic experts reviewed previous reports, cross-checked them with the actual condition of the remains, and identified forensic questions that could not be answered due to lack of suitable tools. The re-examination process focused on reviewing bone structure, remaining biological traces, and any factors that might allow additional inferences about the circumstances of death, though not aimed at immediately determining the cause of death, but rather at clarifying the true limitations of the sample and determining the potential for genetic data extraction. While the old forensic conclusions had noted that the condition of the remains did not allow determination of the mechanism of death, the re-examination helped clearly distinguish between factors that were completely unrecoverable and those previously unexploited due to technical limitations, thereby opening new approaches that did not exist before. Concurrently with the re-examination, DNA experts were brought in to assess the potential for genetic analysis from the bone samples, in which DNA extraction was considered at multiple levels, from nuclear DNA to mitochondrial DNA, to maximize the chances of obtaining valuable data, despite the samples having endured long periods and environmental impacts. The modern DNA analysis process was built on the cautious assumption that not every sample would yield results, and therefore the steps were implemented in priority order to minimize the risk of damaging samples in unnecessary attempts. When samples were deemed suitable, DNA extraction and amplification were performed in a strictly controlled environment, with measures to prevent cross-contamination and quality degradation, and every result, whether successful or not, was documented in detail to serve the overall evidentiary assessment. In this context, obtaining a DNA sample from Emily Whitmore, Laura's daughter, became a key operational step to create a direct genetic reference point, because the clear blood relationship allowed Emily's data to be used as a reliable reference standard in confirming and analyzing the recovered samples. The sampling process was conducted in full compliance with current legal and medical procedures, ensuring voluntariness, transparency, and usability of the data for investigative purposes, while fully documenting the chain of custody for this DNA sample as part of the evidence file. Once Emily's genetic data was completed, experts proceeded to compare it with the DNA samples extracted from the remains, not only to confirm the already recognized mother-daughter relationship, but to assess the reliability and quality of the extracted genetic samples, thereby determining whether they were suitable for further in-depth analysis. The genetic data comparison was performed using modern algorithms and databases, allowing analysis of kinship probability with far higher accuracy than the methods available in the late 1980s, and the results provided a level of confirmation previously unattainable. This not only strengthened the legal foundation of the file, but also demonstrated that the bone samples, despite the passage of time, could still provide genetic data of sufficient quality for investigation, thereby opening the possibility of broader comparisons with other data, if needed. Throughout the forensic and DNA process, the investigation team maintained close coordination between technical and operational units, ensuring that all scientific conclusions were placed within the overall investigative context, avoiding over-interpretation or assigning to genetic data meanings beyond what it could prove. Investigators also took care to fully document the limitations of the analysis, because even though technology had advanced, DNA is not an all-powerful tool, and understanding what it cannot answer is just as important as exploiting what it can provide. The outcome of this phase was an updated set of forensic and genetic data, in which Laura Jean Whitmore's kinship was confirmed with high accuracy. The quality of the genetic samples was clearly assessed, and the potential for using them in subsequent analysis steps was specifically determined from an operational perspective. Completing the forensic re-examination and modern DNA analysis marked a fundamental shift from the initial investigation phase. When questions once considered unanswerable now had a technical basis for approach, and the case moved to a state where scientific evidence no longer served only to confirm consequences, but began to become an active tool in clarifying the chain of events and connections between the victim and other individuals. In that context, the obtained genetic data was not viewed as an immediate solution, but as a new, more solid foundation that allowed investigators to build subsequent analysis steps with higher accuracy and verifiability, reducing reliance on speculation and opening the possibility of breaking through the dead ends that had persisted for decades in the Laura Jean Whitmore case. From the forensic and genetic data foundation strengthened after the re-examination phase, the subsequent analysis focused on determining whether, beyond the DNA used to confirm identity and kinship, there existed any additional genetic traces that could hold investigative value. And it was in this context that the cold case team began to notice signals indicating that the recovered samples reflected not only the victim's presence, but also contained genetic components inconsistent with Laura Jean Whitmore's profile, or those of individuals previously compared. The identification of additional DNA traces was not performed as a single step, but as the result of repeated analysis processes in which experts carefully examined extraction results, assessed possibilities of cross-contamination, sample degradation, or technical error before drawing any conclusions about the existence of second genetic material. When quality control measures confirmed that these signals could not be explained simply by noise or technical deviation, the investigation team began to regard this as additional DNA traces with investigative potential, and this was immediately recorded as a significant discovery in the file. Experts conducted deeper analysis to determine the nature of these traces, including assessing the completeness of the genetic profile, the ability to classify biological sex, and the degree of sample fragmentation, to determine whether it was suitable for subsequent comparison steps. During this process, investigators were particularly cautious not to assign to the additional DNA traces meanings beyond what the data actually allowed, because in cold cases, the risk of misinterpreting a scientific discovery could lead to pursuing costly but baseless investigative directions. When technical analysis showed that the additional DNA traces met the minimum quality threshold for evaluation, the investigation team moved to assessing the investigative value of this discovery, focusing on the core question not of who owns the DNA, but of what role this data can play in clarifying the case's chain of events. The investigative value assessment was conducted across multiple aspects, including the ability to link the trace to a specific time and context, its compatibility with previously posed hypotheses, and its potential to narrow or expand the investigative scope without conflicting with confirmed facts. In the context of the Laura Whitmore case, the greatest value of the additional DNA traces did not lie in immediately pointing to a specific individual, but in breaking the decades-long assumption that no physical evidence existed that could directly link the case to anyone other than the victim. From an operational perspective, the mere existence of an unidentified DNA trace was enough to change the overall view of the file, because it opened the possibility that Laura's disappearance and death involved a specific interaction with another person, rather than a completely untraceable chain of events. When assessing investigative value, the cold case team also considered the legal and scientific limitations of using additional DNA data, including the possibility that it might have transferred to the sample in a context unrelated to the crime, and therefore determining the context of the trace's appearance became a key factor before deciding to expand the investigation. To address this issue, forensic experts and investigators coordinated to evaluate the location and type of sample from which the DNA trace was extracted, cross-referencing with information on recovery, handling and storage methods to determine the reasonableness of assuming direct relevance to the events leading to Laura's death. When these assessments showed no clear factors excluding direct relevance, the additional DNA trace was upgraded from a technical discovery to an official investigative lead, and this decision was fully documented in the file along with supporting scientific and operational grounds. It was at this point that a new investigative direction began to form, not as a complete hypothesis, but as a set of questions to be answered based on the existence of the unidentified DNA trace, including who the owner of the trace is, what connection they had to Laura Jean Whitmore, and where their presence could be placed in the reconstructed timeline. The opening of the new investigative direction was carried out in a controlled manner, with clear objectives to avoid overexpanding the scope without strategy, and investigators determined that every subsequent step had to be built on the ability to compare genetic data with other sources of information, rather than on isolated speculation. During this process, the cold case team also re-examined leads previously overlooked or undervalued. In the initial investigation phase, placing them alongside the new DNA discovery, to determine whether any overlaps or complementarities could increase the investigative value of both. From an operational perspective, the discovery of additional DNA traces was not regarded as the solution to the case, but as a catalyst that changed the investigative state, shifting the matter from a passive reanalysis phase to an active phase of building new approaches based on scientific evidence. The result of this phase was a marked change in how the Laura Whitmore file was perceived. When for the first time after many decades the case was no longer defined solely by what could not be determined, but began to be shaped by a new fact capable of connecting long-standing gaps. The opening of a new investigative direction based on additional DNA traces therefore carried not only technical significance, but also strategic significance, as it allowed the investigation team to rebuild objectives and priorities, focusing on identifying and comparing genetic data as a viable path to getting closer to clarifying what happened to Laura Jean Whitmore during the period when the case had been considered impossible to advance. From the moment the additional DNA trace was determined to have investigative value, the entire operational focus shifted to comparing genetic data, in order to answer the core question that the case file had left unresolved for many decades: whether this trace could be linked to a specific individual, and if so, what kind of connection that person had to the disappearance and death of Laura Jean Whitmore. The DNA comparison process was not implemented as a random search step, but was built on a structured strategy, beginning with identifying the range of usable data, the legally accessible genetic storage systems, and the criteria that needed to be met for a comparison result to be considered sufficiently reliable from both a scientific and legal standpoint. The genetic analysis experts, in coordination with investigators, determined that the additional DNA profile, although incomplete, still met the necessary threshold to proceed with expanded comparison, and this decision marked the first time the Laura Whitmore case had the potential to directly access an individual other than the victim based on biological evidence.
The comparison process took place in stages, in which partial matches were carefully evaluated, ruling out the possibility of random coincidence or indirect connections without investigative significance, and only when the probability indicators reached the permitted level was a personal profile added to the list for serious consideration. It was precisely during this screening process that the genetic data began to show compatibility with an individual who had a matching biological profile, and the identification of the name Edward Paul Hanley emerged as a result of a clearly scientifically grounded chain of comparisons, rather than speculation or subjective selection by investigators. Once this name was identified, the next operational step was not to treat Hanley as a default suspect, but to conduct independent verification of all related information to assess whether the genetic match could be explained by other scenarios, such as cross-contamination, unrecorded familial relationships, or factors outside the context of the case. To do this, investigators reviewed Edward Paul Hanley's personal file, including identity information, residence history, occupation, and other administrative data that could help establish his presence in the space and time relevant to the case. A key verification axis was determining whether Hanley was in Illinois in 1987, because if he could not be placed in the appropriate geographic and temporal range, the investigative value of the DNA result would be significantly diminished. This presence check was carried out by cross-referencing residence records, employment data, administrative documents, and any legal sources of information that could prove or rule out the possibility that Hanley had lived, worked, or passed through the Charleston area during the period when Laura Whitmore disappeared. The review results showed that Hanley had a geographic connection to the area during the necessary time frame, a finding of significant reinforcement when placed alongside the obtained genetic data, as it ruled out the possibility that the DNA match was merely a phenomenon unrelated to the case context. Once the 1987 presence was confirmed at an administrative level, investigators continued to evaluate the potential connection between Edward Paul Hanley and Laura Jean Whitmore, not to immediately seek incriminating evidence, but to determine whether these two individuals had any points of intersection in daily life, work, or social environment that could explain the appearance of the DNA trace. The connection evaluation was conducted broadly, starting with examining possibilities of indirect contact, such as appearing together in public spaces, work environments, or community activities, before gradually narrowing to more direct contact possibilities, if supported by data. During this process, the investigation team was particularly cautious not to infer a connection based solely on geographic overlap, because in a community, the coexistence of multiple individuals in the same space does not automatically create an investigatively meaningful relationship. Therefore, every hypothesis about a connection had to be placed against the reconstructed timeline from 1987, to determine whether there was any realistic possibility for Hanley and Laura to have met during the critical empty time periods. Concurrently with evaluating direct connections, investigators also considered whether Hanley was involved in other behaviors or events in the area at that time, even if not necessarily directly related to Laura, to determine whether his behavioral profile showed patterns consistent with involvement in an event leading to the victim's death, and this was done by reviewing public records, legal data, and available administrative information. Throughout the narrowing process, the core operational principle maintained was the separation between suspicion and conclusion, meaning that although Edward Paul Hanley began to emerge as an individual with a high degree of relevance, he was still only regarded as a subject requiring deeper verification until sufficient grounds existed to upgrade his status. The outcome of this phase was the formation of a structured suspect profile, in which the DNA data provided the scientific foundation, the 1987 presence provided the geographic context, and the evaluation of the connection to the victim provided the logical analysis framework, all combining to determine that Edward Paul Hanley was the individual most suitable to become the focus of the next investigation. From an operational perspective, narrowing down the suspect at this stage did not carry conclusive meaning, but rather the official transition from possibility-based investigation to investigation focused on a specific subject, marking the first time in the history of the Laura Jean Whitmore case that the investigating agency had an individual who could be placed at the center of analysis with scientific and administrative data support, creating a substantial turning point compared to the prolonged deadlock that had existed before.
As soon as Edward Paul Hanley was identified as the central subject of the new investigative direction, all operational efforts shifted to the supplemental investigation phase with the goal of comprehensively and independently examining his potential involvement, beginning with verifying his alibi during the 1987 period when Laura Jean Whitmore disappeared, because placing the suspect in the correct space and time is a prerequisite for any legal steps to be considered. The alibi verification process was not conducted based on a single source of information, but through cross-referencing multiple types of data, including residence records, employment history, administrative documents, and any traces that could prove or disprove Hanley's presence in the Charleston area during the critical empty time periods identified in the timeline. And the investigators approached this task with a neutral assumption that an alibi might exist or not exist, but it had to be verified with objective facts. The initial review showed that information about Hanley's residence and work during that period was not entirely seamless, with gaps in time not clearly recorded in administrative files, and these very gaps became the subject of detailed analysis as investigators sought to determine whether they could align with the time when Laura disappeared. Concurrently with alibi verification, Hanley's personal file was comprehensively reviewed, not limited to basic data such as date of birth, occupation, or address, but extending to travel history, social relationships, and any legal or administrative information that could provide context about his behavior and potential contact with the victim. This review was conducted with the principle of not inferring from extraneous details, but focusing on factors with the potential for direct linkage to the case, such as whether Hanley frequently appeared in areas overlapping with Laura's daily route, or had any connection to locations previously examined in the initial search phase during the personal file analysis. Investigators also examined information that might indicate behavioral patterns, not to conclude motive, but to assess the degree of fit between Hanley's profile and the case context, and all findings were recorded objectively, avoiding assignment or speculation beyond provable facts. The next step in the supplemental investigation phase was evidence matching, a task requiring close coordination between investigators and forensic experts to determine the extent to which the genetic data and other audited physical evidence could be directly linked to Hanley. The matching did not stop at confirming the presence of the DNA trace, but also included evaluating the context in which that trace appeared, determining the likelihood that it was created during the period related to the case, or in a different circumstance without criminal significance. And this process required high caution to avoid overinterpretation from a single piece of evidence. Investigators also considered the possibility of indirect matching between Hanley's profile and other case evidence, such as compatibility between his schedule and key timeline markers, or access to locations related to the recovery of remains, although these factors were not considered independent evidence, but had value in strengthening or weakening the investigative hypothesis. Concurrently with evidence matching, the task of verifying related statements was implemented to cross-reference information obtained from multiple sources, including individuals who had contact with Hanley in the 1987 period, people who could provide information about his presence or behavior, and administrative data sources that could confirm or contradict these statements. The verification was conducted with the principle of not assuming any statement was inherently reliable, but placing them in relation to other facts to assess consistency and informational value, and any inconsistencies, even minor, were recorded and analyzed, to determine whether they reflected memory errors, unintentional confusion, or the possibility of concealing information. In the context of the supplemental investigation, investigators paid special attention to cross-referencing statements with the gaps identified in Hanley's file, because at these points, inconsistency or lack of information could have greater investigative significance than fully recorded periods. Statement verification was not only to reinforce the current hypothesis, but also to test its resilience against counter-arguments, because a solid investigative file must be able to withstand scrutiny even from a skeptical perspective. Throughout the supplemental investigation phase, the cold case team maintained a clear separation between data collection and conclusion evaluation, avoiding allowing focus on a specific subject to lead to confirmation bias, and all findings, whether supporting or not supporting the hypothesis of Hanley's involvement, were recorded with equivalent detail. The combined results of the alibi checks, personal file reviews, evidence matching, and statement verifications showed that the picture of Edward Paul Hanley was becoming increasingly clear, not in the direction of a complete story, but as a set of interwoven facts, in which some elements reinforced the possibility of involvement, while others still required further verification. From an operational perspective, the supplemental investigation phase was not aimed at affirming guilt, but at assessing whether the suspect file was sufficiently solid to move to the next legal phase, and completing this step marked the moment when the Laura Jean Whitmore case, for the first time since 1987, came close to the boundary between pure investigation and legal action, based on the combination of scientific data, administrative information, and systematically and controlled operational analysis. From the supplemental investigation results showing that the suspect file against Edward Paul Hanley had reached a depth and breadth sufficient to be considered from a legal perspective, the investigative process moved to the critical phase of strengthening the prosecution file, in which the goal was no longer simply collecting additional facts, but reorganizing all existing evidence into a coherent logical chain, capable of withstanding rigorous judicial scrutiny. Building the logical evidence chain was done by placing each collected element into a clear causal sequence, starting from Laura Jean Whitmore's disappearance, the gaps in the timeline, the recovery of remains, the existence of the additional DNA trace, to the genetic data comparison, and findings related to Hanley's presence and behavior in the 1987 period, and each link had to be checked to see if it could be proven independently, as well as how it connected to other links. In this process, investigators paid special attention to avoiding building a narrative based on speculation, instead using only facts with clear origins, legally collected, and explainable by objective logic, because any gap in the evidence chain could be exploited to weaken the entire file when presented in court. Strengthening the evidence logic was not only for persuasion, but also for self-testing the file's durability, by posing hypothetical counter-scenarios and examining whether the current evidence chain could withstand reasonable alternative explanations. Concurrently with building logic, another important step implemented was evaluating the legality of each group of evidence, in which all data from DNA analysis results, administrative documents confirming Hanley's presence, to related statements were reviewed through a legal lens, to determine whether they met standards for collection, preservation, and use of evidence. This evaluation process included checking the chain of custody, collection authority, compliance with personal rights regulations, and other procedural requirements, because in cold cases, the risk of legal issues arising with old evidence is always present and needs to be addressed proactively. When potential legally contentious points were discovered, the investigation team did not immediately seek to remove that evidence, but recorded and analyzed its potential impact on the entire file, thereby determining whether supplementation, clarification, or restructuring of evidence use was needed to minimize risk in the prosecution phase. Consultation with prosecutors was implemented as an indispensable step in this phase, because the goal of the file was not only to meet investigative standards, but also to align with prosecution and trial standards, and therefore early coordination with prosecutors allowed the investigation team to adjust their approach before making irreversible decisions. In the consultation sessions, investigators presented the entire evidence chain, explained the logic connecting the facts, and listened to the prosecutor's assessment of the sufficiency for prosecution, the strengths that could be emphasized, and the weaknesses needing further reinforcement, and this exchange was two-way, ensuring that the final file was not only tight operationally, but also feasible legally. Prosecutors paid special attention to the ability to explain the evidence chain to a jury, raising questions about the intuitiveness, reliability, and counter-argument potential of each element, and this feedback was used by the investigation team to refine the file, clarify connections, and remove unnecessary details that could dilute the case focus. When necessary adjustments were made, and the file reached a level assessed by both investigators and prosecutors as sufficiently strong, the landmark decision was made to consider arresting Edward Paul Hanley, a decision not based solely on belief in his potential involvement, but on a comprehensive assessment that the current evidence chain met the necessary legal threshold to proceed with coercive action. The arrest decision was not made hastily, as it carried major legal and strategic consequences, including activating the suspect's rights, exposing the investigative direction, and creating pressure to protect the file under public scrutiny, and therefore the investigation team carefully weighed the timing, method, and scope of this action. During consideration, factors such as the risk of the suspect fleeing, the possibility of evidence destruction, and the impact of delay versus immediate action were evaluated realistically, and when these factors were placed against the file's readiness level, the final conclusion was formed that the conditions for proceeding with arrest had fully converged. From an operational perspective, the prosecution file's strengthening phase marked a clear transition of the Laura Jean Whitmore case, from a decades-long investigation to a specific legal process, in which every decision had to be measured by its ability to withstand court scrutiny, and reaching the decision to arrest Edward Paul Hanley reflected a well-founded confidence that the evidence chain had been built, evaluated, and reviewed sufficiently tightly to cross the investigative threshold and enter the phase of legal enforcement, opening a new chapter for a case that had been frozen for so long. Immediately after the decision to arrest Edward Paul Hanley was made based on a comprehensive assessment of the chain of evidence and the legal readiness of the case file, the investigation shifted to the execution phase with high demands for accuracy, risk control, and strict adherence to procedural rules, because any error in this phase could undermine the entire effort built over many years. The first step was arrest planning, a process implemented systematically with the involvement of relevant units to determine the most appropriate timing, location, and approach method, in which investigators thoroughly analyzed Hanley's current activity profile, including residence, travel habits, recent contacts, and factors that could affect the safety of the executing force, as well as the ability to preserve evidence. The planning not only focused on achieving a successful arrest, but also on minimizing the risk of confrontation, avoiding situations that could endanger the community or the suspect himself, and ensuring that every action could be explained and defended in court if necessary. During this process, various scenarios were developed, from approaching the suspect at his residence to other possibilities, such as at the workplace or during movement, and each scenario was evaluated based on criteria of safety, situational control, and the degree of convenience for seizing additional evidence. Parallel to developing the operational plan, necessary legal procedures were completed, including ensuring a valid arrest warrant, determining the permitted scope of seizure, and preparing required documents to inform the suspect of his rights in accordance with regulations, to ensure that all subsequent actions would not be subject to legal dispute. When the execution timing was determined, participating units were assigned specific tasks, from the force directly approaching the suspect, support forces securing the area, to officers responsible for recording events,
and handling evidence on site, and this coordination was rehearsed to the necessary extent to ensure synchronized action. The arrest was carried out according to the established plan, with the executing force approaching Edward Paul Hanley, under controlled conditions, clearly announcing identity and authority, while performing the arrest in accordance with procedure to avoid unnecessary use of force. Throughout this process, investigators focused on recording the suspect's reactions, not to infer motive or attitude, but to ensure that all developments were fully documented for subsequent legal and professional evaluation. Once the arrest was completed, the next step was to conduct initial control procedures, including ensuring safety for the suspect and the executing force, preliminary checks to detect any items that could pose danger, and informing basic rights under the law, all performed in sequence to protect the legality of the entire process. Parallel to the arrest, the plan for seizing additional evidence was activated, as this phase was seen as a critical opportunity to collect data that could strengthen or further clarify the established chain of evidence, and the seizure was conducted within the scope permitted by the approved legal order. Investigators searched areas directly related to the suspect according to the plan, recording and sealing any items, documents or data potentially related to the case, while ensuring that all seizure activities were detailed in terms of time, location, and responsible person, to maintain an uninterrupted chain of custody. During the seizure, the principle of caution was prioritized, as investigators avoided immediately interpreting the value of each piece of evidence at the scene, instead focusing on preservation and full recording, so that expert evaluations could be conducted under controlled conditions later. The seizure of additional evidence was not limited to tangible items, but also included recording administrative information or data that could be used for later cross-verification, all handled according to procedure to ensure integrity and admissibility in court. After on-site activities were completed, the suspect was transferred in accordance with regulations for subsequent legal procedures, while seized evidence was handed over to the Storage and Analysis Department with full accompanying records. From a professional perspective, the arrest phase was not considered the end of the investigation, but an important transition from evidence gathering to verification, in an official legal context, where every action and fact must be placed under strict procedural oversight. The successful execution of the arrest plan for Edward Paul Hanley reflected thorough preparation and close coordination between departments, while affirming that the case file had reached a sufficiently solid level to withstand legal and public pressure, creating conditions for subsequent steps to be implemented on a strengthened evidentiary foundation. The direct result of this phase was that the suspect was placed under lawful control of the law enforcement agency, and a set of additional evidence was seized and preserved, ready for analysis and evaluation in the next steps of the legal process, marking the first time since 1987 that the Laura Jean Whitmore case shifted from prolonged investigation status to specific coercive action with clear legal consequences.
After Edward Paul Hanley was lawfully arrested and transferred to detention status for investigation, the focus of the case entered the interrogation phase, a professional step not aimed at seeking a confession at any cost, but at testing the resilience of the entire evidence file when placed before the suspect's direct response, while determining how Hanley's statements could be integrated into the legal structure of the case. The interrogation process was organized within a strict legal framework, with the suspect fully informed of his statutory rights and all developments recorded to ensure that any information obtained would not be invalidated later due to procedural errors, because in cold cases, especially those spanning decades, the legality of each step becomes a vital factor determining successful prosecution. Investigators approached the interrogation with thorough preparation, pre-building groups of topics to clarify, rather than a disjointed series of questions, with the focus including Hanley's schedule in 1987, his presence in Illinois at the time Laura Jean Whitmore disappeared. social relationships and living circumstances that could create intersections with the victim, as well as explanations for the existence of the identified DNA trace. Throughout the questioning, investigators maintained a neutral tone and controlled the pace of the interrogation, avoiding direct confrontational pressure, because the goal was not to make the suspect defensive, but to encourage him to present naturally about related events, thereby creating conditions to assess the internal consistency of his statements. As Hanley began describing his past, investigators recorded in detail each timeline marker, location, and relationship mentioned, not only for cross-checking with existing files, but also to identify areas of the statement that remained vague or lacking specific information, as these points are often where differences emerge between actual memory and adjusted statements. The interrogation was conducted in multiple rounds, in which the same topic could be revisited at different times or from different angles to test the stability of the statements, and small changes in narrative style, event order or level of detail were carefully noted for later analysis. Parallel to collecting statements, cross-verification occurred almost simultaneously as investigators continually compared what Hanley said with confirmed facts in the file. From reconstructed timelines, administrative documents on residence and employment, to scientific results such as DNA analysis and other audited physical evidence, and this cross-verification was not aimed at pointing out contradictions immediately in the interrogation room, but at building an overall picture of the compatibility between statements and evidence. When inconsistencies appeared, investigators did not hastily conclude they were signs of deceit, but analyzed whether the inconsistency could be reasonably explained by time factors, memory degradation, or unintentional confusion, and only when an inconsistency could not be explained by those factors was it flagged as a legally significant issue. In this process, gaps in Hanley's alibi became a special focus, as these were points identified from the supplemental investigation phase as factors making him the primary suspect, and whether Hanley could or could not provide clear, consistent explanations for those gaps held critical meaning for strengthening the prosecution file. Investigators also paid attention to how Hanley reacted when asked about details independently confirmed by the file, because in interrogation practice, the alignment between reaction and the authenticity of the fact often provides important indirect information about the reliability of the statements. When Hanley's statements were placed alongside genetic data, the investigation team maintained the principle of not using DNA results as a direct pressure tool in interrogation, but letting it serve as an independent comparison standard to assess whether the suspect's explanations could coexist with scientific evidence without logical conflict. The legal value assessment of statements occurred throughout the entire interrogation phase, as each utterance was examined for courtroom usability, including determining voluntariness, clarity, and sufficient specificity to avoid ambiguous interpretations or later rebuttals, and investigators always recorded not only the content of statements, but also the context and conditions under which they were made. Another important factor in legal evaluation was determining whether Hanley's statements, even without confession, could provide indirect information to strengthen the chain of evidence, such as admitting presence in an area, confirming a connection with an individual or circumstance, or inadvertently clarifying part of the reconstructed timeline, and such factors, if present, were carefully considered for legal usability. Throughout the interrogation phase, the investigation team maintained clear awareness that the goal was not to achieve a quick result, but to protect the long-term integrity of the file, as a confession obtained by non-standard methods could cause far greater harm than having no confession at all. When the interrogation sessions ended, all statements were compiled, categorized, and analyzed in relation to existing evidence to determine overall consistency and points needing further clarification through other investigative measures. From a professional perspective, the core value of the interrogation phase lay in testing the file's resilience against the suspect's direct feedback, evaluating whether the chain of evidence could stand against alternative explanations and determining the case's readiness for subsequent procedural stages. The outcome of this process was not a simple answer about whether the suspect confessed, but a comprehensive assessment of whether the constructed prosecution file was sufficiently tight, legal, and consistent to continue the legal process with controlled risk, marking the moment when the Laura Jean Whitmore case, after nearly 4 decades, was first directly challenged before the very person placed at the center of suspicion. Immediately after the interrogation phase concluded, and all of Edward Paul Hanley's statements had been compiled, cross-checked, and evaluated for legal value, the case process moved to the court file preparation phase, a critical transitional stage, where the focus was no longer on discovering new leads, but on transforming the entire decades-long investigation results into a complete, tightly structured prosecution file, capable of withstanding rigorous court scrutiny. Completing the prosecution file was implemented by systematizing all collected evidence, from forensic data, DNA analysis, administrative investigation results, interrogation records, to professional conclusions, and each component was re-examined to ensure it was not only accurate in content, but also fully met the formal and procedural requirements under current litigation law. In this process, the investigation team worked closely with the legal department to recheck every link in the evidence chain, clearly identifying the origin, collection method, custody chain, and intended use of each document to eliminate risks of weaknesses that could be exploited during trial. Parallel to perfecting the file content, evidence classification and arrangement were also strategically performed to ensure that when presented in court, the legal narrative of the case was coherent, easy to follow, and accurately reflected the causal logic built throughout the investigation. Coordination with prosecutors played a central role in this phase, as prosecutors directly participated in file review, issuing additional requirements or necessary adjustments to ensure the final indictment accurately reflected the level of evidence and aligned with the prosecution strategy. In joint working sessions, investigators and prosecutors analyzed the file's strengths and potential rebuttal points, developing hypothetical trial scenarios to test the defensibility of each evidence group against potential defense arguments. A thoroughly discussed content was how to present and explain scientific evidence, especially DNA data, to the jury, because despite its high probative value, such evidence still needed clear, understandable interpretation to avoid unnecessary confusion or doubt. Prosecutors and the investigation team agreed that thorough preparation of the scientific explanation portion, including anticipating rebuttal questions and appropriate responses, was key to protecting evidence value in court. Parallel to that, the trial strategy was built by clearly identifying the case's focus, selecting elements to emphasize and those serving only supportive roles, to avoid diluting the main message or creating exploitable gaps. This strategy related not only to evidence presentation, but also to witness order arrangement, introducing the decades-long case context and explaining why decisive evidence could only be discovered in the context of modern technology. During preparation, the investigation team also focused on re-examining the entire file from a timing perspective, ensuring that reopening the case after many decades was explained reasonably and convincingly, preventing the defense from exploiting time factors to undermine evidence reliability. This included preparing clear arguments about forensic science advancements, legal reasons for reanalysis, and how new findings logically connected with old facts throughout the court file preparation phase. The investigation team maintained maximum caution, as this was the point where any minor oversight could have major consequences in trial, and thus every decision, from retaining or excluding a document to phrasing a professional conclusion, was carefully considered. From a professional perspective, this phase lacked the drama of arrest or interrogation, but played a decisive role in the ability to bring the case to a legal and sustainable conclusion, as it determined how the entire investigation story would be presented before the justice system, as court file preparation work gradually completed. The Laura Jean Whitmore case officially entered a new state, where the results of decades of investigation, stalemates, and reopening were crystallized into a clearly structured prosecution file, ready to enter the trial phase, with the goal not only of charging an individual, but of providing a convincing legal resolution to a case that had haunted local judicial records for many decades. As soon as the formal indictment was accepted, and the case entered the trial phase, the entire investigative process that had spanned nearly 4 decades was transformed into a public legal dialogue at the courtroom, where every operational decision, every piece of scientific evidence, and every investigative conclusion had to undergo rigorous scrutiny by the judicial system, and here, the focus was no longer on discovering new truths, but on proving that what had been discovered possessed sufficient reliability, legality, and persuasiveness to surpass the threshold of reasonable doubt. The trial was conducted in a strictly structured sequence, with the prosecution opening by presenting an overview designed to place the jury in the context of the case, reconstructing the chain of events from the moment Laura Jean Whitmore disappeared in 1987, the fruitless search efforts, the discovery of the remains, and the prolonged impasse, until the file was reopened in 2025, thanks to advances in forensic science. And the goal of this opening was not to evoke emotion, but to provide a logical framework to help the jury understand why the case should be evaluated based on the totality of the evidence, rather than individual elements in isolation. During the evidence presentation phase, the prosecution deployed groups of evidence, according to a carefully prepared structure, beginning with foundational facts, such as confirming the identity of the remains, through re-examination by forensic experts, and DNA comparison with Emily Whitmore, to firmly establish that the samples used in the case truly belonged to Laura Jean Whitmore. From that foundation, the prosecution moved on to present connecting evidence, particularly the existence of additional DNA traces identified during reanalysis, clearly explaining the extraction methods, cross-contamination controls, and how experts determined that these traces could not be dismissed as random or unrelated factors. Each step of the presentation was accompanied by documents, images, and detailed explanations to help the jury, people without specialized backgrounds, understand the nature and value of the complex scientific evidence. When addressing the link between the DNA traces and Edward Paul Hanley, the prosecution emphasized that this was not an isolated result or speculation, but the outcome of genetic data comparison conducted according to strict scientific standards, reinforced by administrative records, confirming Hanley's presence in Illinois in 1987, and unexplained gaps in his alibi. To avoid giving the impression that the case rested solely on DNA, the prosecution continued by presenting other supporting evidence, including a reconstructed timeline, additional investigative findings, and how these facts intersected to form a continuous logical chain, leading to the defendant. Throughout this process, the defense engaged in legal contestation by cross-examining each group of evidence, focusing on questioning the reliability of old samples, the possibility of degradation over time, the risk of analytical errors, and the legality of reopening the file after many decades. The defense also emphasized the factor of time as a central argument, contending that witnesses' memories had faded, initial records might be incomplete, and connecting old facts with new scientific results could lead to inference. In response to these arguments, the prosecution countered by clarifying that the case did not rely on witness memory as a decisive factor, but on physical and scientific evidence, strictly controlled, and that advances in forensic science provided a legal basis for re-examining files that had previously been unsolvable. A key part of the trial was the expert testimony from scientific witnesses,
including forensic pathologists and DNA analysis experts, who were called not to offer subjective opinions, but to explain the methods, reliability, and limitations of the techniques used in their testimony. The experts detailed the process of re-examining the remains, why the forensic conclusions from 1987 were no longer barriers to modern analysis, and how DNA data was extracted, compared, and probabilistically evaluated objectively. When cross-examined, the experts transparently acknowledged scientific limitations, while explaining why those limitations did not undermine the overall probative value of the evidence, but instead demonstrated caution and adherence to standards in reaching conclusions. During the contestation, procedural issues were also raised before the court, including whether the use of evidence collected and analyzed after many decades infringed on the defendant's rights, and the parties presented arguments based on legal precedents related to cold cases, in which the court was asked to balance the defendant's right to a fair trial with the interest of justice in resolving serious unsolved crimes. These debates were not merely technical, but reflected how the modern judicial system approaches long-standing cases, and the jury was instructed to understand that time alone does not invalidate evidence if legal standards are met. As the trial progressed, questions from the jury showed they were concerned not only with who was responsible, but also with how the scientific evidence connected to form a consistent legal narrative. And these questions were addressed through additional testimony and arguments from both sides, helping to clarify potential points of confusion. In the final phase, both the prosecution and defense delivered closing arguments, in which the prosecution summarized the logical chain of evidence, emphasizing that the combination of scientific, administrative, and operational facts had surpassed reasonable doubt, while the defense urged the jury to carefully consider remaining gaps and the responsibility to protect the presumption of innocence. From an overall perspective, the trial was not only the place to determine the legal fate of Edward Paul Hanley, but also the final test for the entire investigation and re-investigation process of the Laura Jean Whitmore case, where every scientific and operational effort was placed under the public light of the law. As the trial entered the deliberation phase, the atmosphere in the courtroom clearly reflected the weight of a case that had lasted nearly 40 years, where the question was not only whether the defendant committed the crime, but whether justice could be administered convincingly, legally, and responsibly, after all that time. And it was at this moment that the entire journey of the case crystallized into a landmark legal decision, marking the boundary between the search for truth and the official verdict of the judicial system. Immediately after the trial concluded the contestation phase, and the jury entered deliberation, the entire legal process of the Laura Jean Whitmore case temporarily quieted during a decisive period, where all arguments, evidence, and testimony that had been publicly presented were independently weighed according to the highest legal standards, and when the jury returned to the courtroom to announce the verdict, the focus of the case shifted from proof to the official establishment of criminal responsibility. The verdict was announced in the solemn atmosphere of the court, reflecting the outcome of evaluating whether the chain of evidence presented by the prosecution had surpassed reasonable doubt, and the pronouncement was not merely a formal procedure, but the moment when the judicial system provided the final legal answer to a case that had existed for nearly 4 decades. When the judgment was delivered, the court clearly stated the legal grounds leading to the conclusion, including acceptance of the probative value of modern scientific evidence, the consistency of the logical chain of evidence, and how independent facts had been connected to determine the defendant's responsibility for the disappearance and death of Laura Jean Whitmore. In the sentencing portion, the judge clarified that the court's decision was not based on a single factor, but on the totality of evidence that had been examined, contested, and evaluated according to proper procedural rules. While emphasizing the jury's role in objectively considering the entire record, the judgment also recognized the special nature of the cold case, in which the passage of time did not diminish the judicial system's obligation to examine evidence fairly and legally, and the application of scientific advances was not considered prejudicial to the defendant if legal standards were fully met. Following the declaration of criminal responsibility, the court moved to determining specific legal consequences, in which the sentence was decided based on the current penalty framework, aggravating and mitigating circumstances considered under the law, and factors related to the seriousness of the act and its consequences for the victim and society. Determining legal consequences aimed not only at punishment, but also at demonstrating the principles of fairness and consistency in the law, especially in the context of a case that had spanned many years with profound psychological and social impacts. In this part, the court clarified that the sentence reflected the judicial system's assessment of the proven degree of criminal responsibility, while considering procedural factors related to the time elapsed, the defendant's current status, and the feasibility of enforcing the sentence under the law. The legal consequences of the verdict extended beyond determining punishment to include decisions on officially recording the case outcome in the judicial system, updating legal records, and establishing precedent for handling cold cases based on modern scientific evidence. The court also outlined the subsequent rights of the parties, including the right to appeal under the law, thereby emphasizing that the verdict was the result of a complete legal process yet still subject to the judicial system's mechanisms of oversight and review. From a broader legal perspective, the verdict in the Laura Jean Whitmore case was seen as proof of the judicial system's ability to resolve pending cases through the combination of operational investigation and scientific progress, while affirming that time is not an absolute barrier to establishing criminal responsibility. If proof standards are met, the legal consequences of the judgment also posed long-term impacts on law enforcement agencies, as it strengthened the legal basis for reopening and pursuing other cold cases, encouraging the preservation and reanalysis of evidence according to new scientific standards. In this context, the verdict did not merely close a specific case, but sent a broader legal message about the judicial system's responsibility to pursue justice persistently and responsibly, no matter how much time had passed. When the sentencing session ended, the case officially transitioned from the trial phase to the post-trial phase, where the legal consequences of the verdict began to be enforced and recorded, marking the first time since 1987 that Laura Jean Whitmore's disappearance was determined by a clear and effective legal conclusion. From an operational perspective, this verdict reflected the convergence of many years of investigation, review, reanalysis and contestation, and its public announcement demonstrated the judicial system's commitment to providing the final legal answer to a case once considered unsolvable. Concluding the verdict phase, the case entered a new state, where the focus was no longer on proof or argument, but on enforcing and recording the legal consequences of a decision made according to proper procedure and authority, under the law.
Immediately after the verdict was announced and the legal consequences officially established, the investigation process of the Laura Jean Whitmore case entered its final operational phase of closing the file, a phase that was not merely formal but reflected the entire investigative system shifting from a state of pursuit and proof to one of summarization, confirmation, and archiving, in which all open investigative activities were reviewed, completed, or terminated according to proper authority and procedure. The conclusion of the investigation did not occur immediately after the trial, but was carried out through a series of internal checks to ensure that no investigative leads remained unaddressed, no additional requests from the prosecution or court existed, and all related evidence had been fully evaluated, used appropriately, and recorded with final results in the official file. Cold case investigators conducted a review of the entire task list, from leads opened during the reinvestigation phase to side branches that had been ruled out, to confirm that no further operational activities needed to be deployed after criminal responsibility had been determined by an effective judgment. In this process, hypotheses that had been raised but never became central were also noted with their final status, not for continued pursuit, but to ensure the file fully reflected the history of investigative thinking and the reasons why each direction had been lawfully and justifiably closed. Once it was confirmed that the investigation had substantively concluded, the next step was to officially close the file, a procedure with clear legal and administrative significance, in which the case was transferred from active processing to resolved status, and all related documents were organized, sealed, and archived according to regulations. Closing the file included not only storing investigative documents, but also updating the final outcome in case management systems, judicial databases, and specialized archives for serious crimes to ensure the case's legal status was consistently reflected across all management levels. During this phase, investigators coordinated with legal departments to clearly determine the scope of documents requiring long-term preservation, especially physical evidence and scientific data with historical or precedential value, while ensuring the chain of custody was validly concluded without creating gaps that could later cause disputes. Updating the case status was performed simultaneously across multiple aspects, including internal updates within the investigative agency, official notifications to previously coordinating units, and recording the final status in judicial statistical reports, and each update reflected that the Laura Jean Whitmore case was no longer classified as a cold case or open investigation, but as a case resolved by court verdict. From an operational perspective, this status update was significant because it terminated all further investigative authority related to the adjudicated act, while clarifying that any future legal activities, if any, would fall under post-trial or appeal scopes rather than initial criminal investigation. During updates, relevant agencies also recorded the case as a typical example of reopening and resolving a cold case based on scientific progress, and this recording was operational rather than promotional, intended to serve training, research, and future reference. Alongside administrative and legal procedures, closing the file also included an internal summarization phase, where investigators, forensic experts, and coordinating units reevaluated the entire investigative process to draw operational lessons, identify factors that created breakthroughs, and limitations that had previously caused impasse. This summarization process was not aimed at assigning individual responsibility, but at improving the system, recognizing the role of long-term evidence preservation, the importance of periodic reviews of old files, and the value of interagency coordination in complex long-term cases. Conclusions drawn from the summarization were recorded in internal reports, not as part of the public file, but as operational documents to enhance future investigative capabilities. When all file closing procedures were completed, the Laura Jean Whitmore case officially left the daily operational state of the investigative agency, but did not disappear from the judicial system, remaining preserved as a resolved file, with full investigation, trial, and verdict history. From a legal perspective, closing the file affirmed that the state had fully fulfilled its responsibility to investigate and prosecute, and that the final outcome had been established through a lawful, transparent, and verifiable procedural process. From an operational perspective, it marked the moment when investigators could officially end pursuit of a case that had accompanied them throughout the reopening phase, freeing resources to focus on other files. Closing the file also held symbolic meaning for the local judicial system, as a case once considered unsolvable now had a clear legal conclusion, recorded as proof of the capability of modern investigative processes when implemented persistently, cautiously, and evidence-based. In that context, the final status of the case was not just a system update line, but confirmation that a chain of questions spanning decades had been answered at the highest legal level. When the file was officially closed, the Laura Jean Whitmore case entered a phase of existence as a completed file, where any subsequent actions, if any, no longer belonged to criminal investigation but to post-legal domains, marking the operational end of one of the most complex and longest-running cases in local judicial history. Immediately after the Laura Jean Whitmore case file was officially closed in legal and administrative terms, the ripple effects of the verdict did not remain confined to the courtroom or investigative agencies, but quickly became evident in the life of the local community, where Laura's disappearance had been a lingering memory for many decades. The community's reaction did not occur as an explosive wave of immediate emotion, but manifested as a process of reperception, as residents residents began to revisit what happened in 1987 through a completely different lens, connecting fragmented past memories with the newly established legal conclusion. For many residents who lived in Charleston at the time of Laura's disappearance, the resolution of the case after nearly 40 years created a feeling that was both relieving and heavy, as it simultaneously closed a long-standing question and forced confrontation with the reality that a serious crime had existed silently within the very community they once considered safe and familiar. The local community's reaction was evident in how the case was discussed in public spaces, not as a sensational story, but as a point of reflection on the fragility of everyday life and the possibility of hidden darkness in even the most seemingly peaceful environments. The fact that a person who had lived and worked locally, unnoticed for many years, was now identified as the perpetrator of a serious crime, forced the community to confront questions about how well they truly knew those around them, and whether unusual signs in the past had been overlooked. This shift in perception was not accusatory toward the collective, but reflected a process of self-examination, where the community viewed itself with greater caution and awareness. The impact of the case on the local investigative agency was also profound and lasting, as successfully resolving a decades-long cold case became a significant operational milestone, not only for the final outcome but for the path taken to achieve it. Within law enforcement units, the Laura Whitmore case was regarded as proof of the value of long-term file preservation, the necessity of periodic reviews of pending cases, and the importance of tightly integrating traditional investigative operations with modern scientific advances. The lawful closing of the file also created a new standard for evaluating the potential to reopen old cases, encouraging approaches based on objective analysis of remaining evidence, rather than media prominence or public pressure alone. On a broader scale, this case created clear influence on how law enforcement agencies viewed and handled other cold cases, not by promising that every case could be solved, but by affirming that files once considered dead ends could still hold investigative potential if systematically and scientifically re-examined. Cold case units use the case as a real-world example to illustrate the value of evidence auditing, forensic re-examination, and applying modern genetic analysis methods within strict legal frameworks, thereby promoting reasonable resource allocation to files with similar breakthrough potential. This impact was not mechanical replication, but manifested in a shift in mindset, where investigators became willing to re-question old conclusions rather than treating them as unchangeable endpoints. For the wider community beyond the local area, the Laura Jean Whitmore case became a reference point in how the public viewed cold cases, highlighting the difference between reopening old pain and pursuing justice responsibly. The fact that the case was resolved through a transparent legal process, not based on speculation or public pressure, helped strengthen confidence that the judicial system, though slow in some instances, still had the ability to self-correct and remedy past impasses when conditions allowed. This change in perception was evident in the public's increased interest in the operational and scientific aspects of investigations, rather than focusing solely on dramatic or emotional elements. The meaning of the case after closure did not lie in creating an emotionally complete ending story, but in establishing a clear legal truth for a disappearance once shrouded in suspicion and silence. For the judicial system, it was an affirmation that time does not strip away the responsibility to pursue accountability if evidence is strong and procedures are followed. For the community, it was a reminder that unanswered questions from the past do not necessarily have to be buried forever, and for investigative agencies, it was proof that persistence combined with science and legal discipline could turn seemingly unsolvable files into cases with clear conclusions. As the aftermath of the case gradually subsided, Laura Jean Whitmore was no longer remembered only as a woman who disappeared in 1987, but as the center of a case that helped reshape how the community, investigative agencies, and judicial system viewed cold cases. The case closed not in silence, but in a new state of stability, where the past was placed in its proper position in legal history, and the present continued to operate with lessons learned in that context. The community aftermath was not disruptive, but reconstructive, leaving a lasting mark on how a decades-long case could be resolved cautiously, legally, and responsibly, closing the journey of the Laura Jean Whitmore file with meaning that extended beyond the case itself. The story of Laura Jean Whitmore reminds people living in the United States today that normal is sometimes just a veneer over risk, and practical preparation is more important than believing that a small town or quiet neighborhood is absolutely safe. Laura was last seen leaving Charleston Elementary School after teaching hours, with no signs of anything unusual. Because everything was so familiar, the family initially reassured themselves that she was just running late. The first lesson is to build safety habits based on real-life routines. If you usually come home on time like Laura, agree with loved ones on a simple check-in point, text when leaving work, share schedule changes, because a few minutes of confirmation can greatly shorten the initial period of uncertainty. The second lesson lies in the family's response. They called acquaintances, checked the route, but as night fell, leads dwindled. This shows that every family should have a clear emergency script. Who calls the police, who contacts colleagues, in this case Charleston Elementary School, who records the last seen timeline, who keeps a list of phone numbers and frequent locations. Third, in modern American life, make use of technology in a minimal but reliable way. Share location when heading home late, set loved ones as ICE contacts, and store basic health information. Finally, the story also emphasizes the value of records and evidence over time, even though the family only took very everyday initial steps, noting the time, the place Laura left school, and the moment they decided to report to police, became crucial data for the entire process later. In other words, safety is not about living in fear, but about turning care into small, clear routines that can be easily implemented in the busy life in the United States. If you find the story of Laura Jean Whitmore reminds us to value safety and those seemingly small details in daily life, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other cold cases that are gradually being revealed. Thank you for following to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to seek answers for the unfinished stories behind the silence.